Hello, everyone. I'm excited to have you join me today for a live demo on how to automate load balancers. First, as a quick introduction, I'm Mike Elram, a senior solutions architect here at Itential. I also lead our POC team, where I've spent a lot of time helping customers execute their network automation use cases with our technology. Today, I'll be sharing some of that insight for one of our popular use cases, load balancer, automating pools, and virtual servers. We'll go through step by step how the Itential automation platform can help automate the load balancing and the process that surrounds it, so you can keep pace with the increasing rate of infrastructure change requests. Feel free to ask questions along the way, and I'll answer them throughout the demo. There are many hidden challenges with load balancers that we see from our customer group. Both services and appliances, whether that be physical or virtual, load balancers could be handled via elastic application services or through network traffic. We see many different vendors, but to mention a few of the more common ones we see by name, we find F5, Citrix NetScaler, A10, and Avi. The most common challenge that we hear from our customers is how can they keep up with the volume? Why is it that the network team is the bottleneck to load balancer services? There are multiple perspectives here. You could think about this from the load balancer administrator that could easily go into their device and make those changes if all they had to do was the provisioning step. You could think about this from the application team that is asking for their application to be configured in the load balancer. You could think about this from the product owner's perspective, that they just want to see their application deployed. Why is this so hard? Why is it taking so long? The answer is everything is simple, but when you combine a lot of simple things together, and there's a lot of things to do for checks and balances and to ensure that the correct service is deployed and ensure there aren't any conflicts with business rules, you've got to enforce a company's policy for standardization. All of that simple turns complicated. You have to ensure that your record has been acknowledged as a change within the change process as well. Lots of pieces, lots of moving parts. And when you put all of this together, it does get complicated. With the ability to automate that end-to-end process from this service request to the change process, provisioning, pre-checks, and validations, we see many customers taking advantage of automating this and offering it as a real-time service. No need to wait for a maintenance window. Itential specializes in automation, integration, and the orchestration of end-to-end processes. We integrate into network devices and platforms, most of the time with our out-of-the-box pre-built adapters and automations. Network engineers become enabled through drag and drop to build automations. Once the automation is built, you'll want to be able to connect that to your ecosystem. That means tying it into your ITSM system, such as ServiceNow, Helix, or another tool. Error handling is another one that often gets overlooked when allotting time for provisioning. As engineers, you've got to be sure the network isn't impacted and you've done your set of due diligence to ensure the service is valid. This process becomes time consuming once you add all of this up, making it a perfect candidate for automation. Today's demonstration, we will use an F5 LTM load balancer. Since some folks watching may be familiar with other load balancers and newer to F5, I wanted to just explain a few key terms that you may hear in today's webinar. We're going to cover pools, which are logical sets of devices, such as web servers that are going to be grouped together to receive and process traffic. We'll cover pool members, logical object groups that represent a traffic node. We'll also be building a virtual server and attaching it to our pool. And that virtual server is a traffic management object that will be represented by a virtual IP. This will be done in a big IP LTM, which is our local traffic manager, leveraged for the local data center deployments. And there's other terms such as GTM, Global Traffic Manager, that handles the regional geographic areas as you combine the LTMs together. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a bit of an architecture here. This depicts our triggers of ways that you can invoke Itential automations. They can be done manually through our catalogs internally. They can be exposed as APIs into your ecosystem. We could also listen to events, and we could also schedule automations and to run within our platform. For today's demonstration, we'll focus on the manual aspect, just focusing on a bit of the Itential components. Inside of today's demonstration, we wanted to make sure we show a few things. So we're going to be creating a new load balancer pool and pool members. We'll be associating and creating a virtual server, associating that virtual server to the pool. We'll be doing a lot of queries throughout the process as part of our pre-builts, just ensuring that we've got the right pre-checks in place and the right post-checks to make sure the service is unique in its naming, and making sure we're not duplicating any resources. Plus, from a post-check side, we want to make sure things have been configured and provisioned correctly. As an added bonus, we're going to be integrating with Microsoft Teams to show some real-time notifications. Again, on the right side of the screen, you can see a little Teams icon. That's an integration through the Itential Automation Platform. We'll also leverage a pre-built for that one. And down at the bottom, we can see the Itential Automation Gateway leveraged for connectivity into F5. If we consider how F5 is typically connected from a perspective, we hear most of our customers looking to see how can they connect it through its REST API. F5 offers a couple different ways. You've got a controller, the Big IQ. You've got direct connectivity into the Big IP directly. And through Big IP, you can go, again, HTTP, or you can go SSH, or some of the more predominant ways that we're seeing. Customers tend to gravitate towards, they want to connect into their F5 from an HTTP perspective. They're not using Big IQ, and they don't want to use the SSH connection. They want to follow the F5 documented REST APIs. So that's why we've got it underneath the Itential Automation Gateway. For those folks that are a little more familiar with the gateway can connect over SSH, connect in the Ansible, connect NetMiko, connect REST, connects in many different ways. So in this particular use case demonstration, we're going to be using the gateway to talk HTTP into the F5. All right, and now we're going to jump into today's demonstration. So first, I wanted to get into F5. I wanted to show you what it would feel like, how it would look for a user to do this manually as an F5 administrator, somebody building in a pool member, and virtual server inside of F5. So I've got the LTM up here. What I'll go ahead and do first is we'll create our pool. And we'll go ahead and call this test webinar 1. And this is our test pool. We'll go ahead and leave a lot of the defaults here. I do want to add some members though. So I like to keep a nice naming convention, test webinar 1 - pool 1. We'll go ahead and apply an address here. And we'll use port 80. I'll add a second one in here. Change the IP address and keep port 80. So we've got our pool and 2 members. I'll click finish, and that's been created. So next up, I'll create the virtual server. This virtual server will do test pool 1 vs1. Test virtual server. Again, leaving a lot of the defaults here. I'll put my destination address here as 10.0.0.0, and we'll just make this .10 at the end. Now this time I'll put 443, doing for HTTPS. What I'm going to do next is kind of scroll down a bit, and we'll set our default pool to the test webinar 1. Click finish there, and that got created. Now overall, relatively painless, but again, what you're not considering is that before I got to this point, I probably swivel chaired into a change request, probably updated my change request state, made sure the approval was set, went ahead and went to an IPAM system, got the IP addresses, made sure that these names weren't here before. I'm obviously in a lab, so this is a pretty empty server, but for an engineer, they typically come in here and make sure that these are unique names, probably standardize some naming convention, implement all these best practice rules that we talked about earlier in our introduction. So when you start adding on all that time, that small process of automation here leads to a big challenge when you talk about the orchestration aspect of this. So we've got this here. If I was going to try to automate this and I wanted to use the HTTP APIs, I would probably follow some documentation like this. F5 exposes the REST API online, and things that we did today, such as the TM-LTM pool. Here's the path for that, the endpoint, different things I can do. I can do gets, I can do puts, patch, delete, and post. In today's demo, what we just did would have been a get call for a validation to make sure things weren't there, and a post call with the resource ID identified in that path just to make sure that was, as we go provision this, we're going to post it in. So this API documentation, the knowledge here, the information, this is something that sometimes you have a developer resource that focuses on. Otherwise, with the Itential pre-builts, we're leveraging this REST API, so you don't have to worry about that. As a network engineer, you get to just follow it through simple inputs. So I'll show you what all of that means as well. As I mentioned in our demonstration, I've got kind of the automation already ready to go. I wanted to do this in two parts. The first part will just show the execution of the automation, everything from the transformation of the data of the input, leveraging the Itential pre-built for the pools and members, leveraging the pre-built for the virtual server, going out through building a payload for Teams and ending up with a pre-built for Microsoft Teams as well, pushing that payload in. So we'll show you how this automation works, and then we'll do a deeper dive and actually deconstruct it and show you how you can build it from scratch. So moving into Operations Manager, this is where we'll execute that automation. I've got the F5 webinar set up here. We'll go ahead and hit run, leveraging one of our triggers. Inside of here, I've got some defaults set up. We'll call this webinar 1, and I'll just add in here IAP at the end so we know this is from IAP. Webinar-1, we'll keep that same naming, -IAP, -IAP. Let's go ahead and check these IP addresses. We'll use the 40 series over here. And all of that looks good. We'll keep that as 40.0.11.1, and we'll make this HTTPS. So similar inputs that we did earlier. This time we're exposing it from an Itential form. I can click View Current Job. What happens is it runs through the pre-builts. You can see all the steps here. This only took 6 seconds as it went through these systems. If I click and visualize, I get my audit view here. The nice part with the audit is, as an engineer, I can go ahead and click any part of this. Now, one of the things you'll probably be looking at glaringly right away is this pre-check has shown up with an error. The idea behind that error is it's actually valid. If you consider what it's trying to do, from an incoming request perspective, we have that path that we saw in the API documentation. We've added the resource ID to it, and we're expecting that that doesn't exist. So our pre-check is making sure we're sending in a unique name here. In this particular response, F5 threw back an error through the LTM API, threw back an error and said the requested pool was not found. That's actually valid. We intended it not to be found. So while the API sends it back as an error, we're acknowledging that error and saying, hey, that's not a problem. That's actually what we wanted through this evaluation task. Go through the provisioning step and hop along the way to the post check. This was our pool execution. If I click into the provisioning, again, audit perspective, we can see the incoming data and we can see the outgoing. And this time it did get provisioned. So if I click back up in our automation, we get back to this parent automation, which is where you want to incorporate your end-to-end process. This is really where you take the value of not just the automation, not just some integrations, but your whole orchestration. So inside of here, like I said, we added the MS Teams. This is where you could put your change request process. This is where you can put your IPAM, any other steps and business rules that you have in place, and even adjust how you have standards to provision these components across your network. The virtual server was very similar, same idea, pre-check. This time that particular pre-check went to a different path. We were looking for the resource of webinar 1 IAP VS1, and we had the same similar error message, this time virtual server. On this particular one, same idea, went through the provisioning step. This provisioning step completed, and we went into our post check. The idea behind the post check, again, very similar endpoint, but this time the resource did exist. The last step in our automation that we had here was our Teams message. So the Teams message actually pulled out some components. It pulled out we had this set up to pull the pool name out of this body with this kind of template and stating it's been provisioned. The outgoing response there was just a simple data substitution, and that was our Teams message that we passed into the Teams workflow. If I go ahead and click into some of these other external systems to show you what happened, I can go ahead and refresh inside of here. So we'll go back into pools and pool list. And we have our webinar IAP right here. Again, this one, we associated 3 members to it, all with service port 80, but we built a virtual server on top of that. That virtual server here is our webinar 1 IAP 1. With a resource associated to the webinar 1 IAP default pool. At the very end there, we saw the Teams message. This one here is that the pool has just been provisioned. So at this point in the demonstration, that was the initial part, just to show you how Itential works with these things from more of an audit operations view aspect. Now I want to show you, let's say you didn't have this already built out here. You're consuming Itential pre-builts. You're going to put it all together yourself. You may incorporate other parts. So this is going to be for the team that now focuses on building these automations. And again, we're not going to build them completely from scratch because we have the advantage of leveraging the Itential pre-builts. So we'll be able to just drop some of these purple boxes on here that have those blocks that we can just reuse inside of our content here. So what I'm going to do there right now is just duplicate this tab and get into the build section. For those, again, for those of you that weren't interested in getting the deep dive, you can feel free to drop off. But if you are interested, this is what we're going to be walking into. So getting a bit technical here, but it'll be good for the folks leveraging to figure out how they can build this stuff. So I've clicked on create because we want a new automation. This will be our workflow. We'll call this webinar F5 build. So inside of this, I get a blank canvas. Once that loads up, there's a few things I know I need. I need that transformation because we got to figure out how I'm going to take my input data and transform that into something that my pre-builds need. Next thing is I need some child jobs. That allows me to incorporate other workflows. In this particular case, they're going to be other Itential workflows, other Itential pre-builds. And pre-builds could be pre-builds of your own as well if you've got a collection of workflows that run repeatable steps that you want to incorporate into your process. Now we need 3 of these because 2 of them for F5 and 1 of them for Teams. The other thing, if you remember, we used a make data just as a kind of simple way to templatize data. Now I want to connect these with transitions. So I'll click on T for transition, or I can click this add edge mode up here and just wire things across. Okay, now we've got to start filling out these. If I open up the JST here and I search for F5, and we'll do the lab F5 create pool and virtual server. This one is asking us for form data. It's going to take our form and transform it into the payload needed for those other pre-builds. I'll swap that from static to job. That allows me to say, hey, the form data will be something that'll be passed into this automation. Then we're going to go into our first child job. This one is going to be for the create pool and members. Now, kind of a best practice here is making sure you're updating your summary and description for something meaningful. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and search for that. So I'll do an F5 search again. This will search the automations loaded in the system, and I'll choose the create pool and members F5. Now, this again offers me job and static, job being the parameters that get passed into the automation, static being something I want to statically assign or hard code. And now I've got a new list appearing. The steps that appear now are any of the tasks that we've gone through before it got to this one. So this particular one, the lab F5, this is our transformation. I'll hit the drop down there for load balancer. Then I'll set this up for pool name, pool description, partition, and pool members. All right, so that one's been configured. Next up, we're going to do the virtual server. So create virtual server. This one asks for a few more bits of information. Again, best practice, we'll rename these. And we'll take this from our transformation as well. This time we've got a virtual server name we can choose, a virtual server description, partition. This is the association to the pool with the pool name, and our destination address and destination port. All right, so that portion on the left here configures our F5. Now we're going to move into grabbing some of that data and sending it over to Teams. So I'll hop over that make data task. We'll go into here for Teams message, Teams message. Let's fix that typo there using Itential pre-built. Again, I'll search for Teams here. That'll pop up since it's been loaded in. And now the title, I'm going to go ahead and use static this time. We'll just say pool created from IAP. And for our text, we'll go ahead and use the output of that convert input, which is our make data task. And that output will be what we pass in there as the text. Now let's go ahead and rename this task because convert input just doesn't sound very good. So we're going to change that name there from the summary. From the default, it's great for a generic name. But as we want to apply the context here, let's make this something more specific. So we'll call this Teams payload. That sounds a bit more appropriate for what we're using it for. And then this will be Teams payload created from F5 data. Our input here, we can say pool and members with virtual server created for pool. And I can use this syntax here with the greater than, less than, exclamation marks to substitute variables. So we can set that. That's going to be just a string input because that's what the pre-built needs. And the variables here, we're going to go ahead and get this just from the form that gets passed in. So we'll change that to form data. Okay, if I did things correct, we should be in good shape. I've hit save, no warnings popped up. And I like to hit the play button here just as a way to kind of check myself from what I've requested. So it looks like the only variable coming in here is our parameter for form data. That looks appropriate to me. So I won't run this yet because I did want to do a little bit of a deeper dive as well. We talked about the JST and we talked about some of these other pre-builts. So let's just pop into a few of those. We'll start with the pre-builts while we're here. So the create pool and members, got those loaded in here. Here we go, create pool and members. Again, this is the one I showed you from an audit perspective, but now we're going to execute this. So when it goes through, it's got its own JST transforming data into the payloads needed for the appropriate F5 steps, going through automation gateway using the HTTP calls. Same idea with the virtual server. Some of that magic is happening in the transformations. So let's pop in there. If I search for F5 here, let's start with the lab one here. This particular one takes our form data and just maps it into independent values so they can be used in the pre-builts. I'll spend a little more time on the create pool and members transformation. This one takes the name, the string, the partition, and the members, and does some mapping. The members get updated to an object that makes sense for the API. These particular provision payloads and validation endpoints, this is all based on that API documentation from F5. Some things worth noting, the name just got passed through as the name, but it also got used, we can see by the second line here, as an input to the concatenation task, which is building out that resource path that we want to check. So the TM LTM pool with the resource name as string 2. I can see how that works by just hitting play here, unchecking this. It's got some test data that's been set up when this pre-built was built, and I can see the payload getting constructed here. That's what we're going to send into F5's REST API. If you're new to transformations and you want to poke around a little bit, there's a drop down on the top right here. You can feel free to kind of just familiarize yourself with some of the samples that come loaded in the system. Otherwise, it's a good idea to also get some of the pre-builts from our site and just kind of get the feel for Itential best practices, how they're built, and some different content you may use. The create virtual server, same idea. Some of the different inputs here, also building out the resource path and also setting up our provisioning and validation payload. You'll also notice down here, we've got the destination address and destination port. Those get concatenated with a colon in between to set that up for the way that F5 is looking to receive that data. Same idea here, we'll go through a test, set up our provisioning payload, which will get sent to F5 and the validation endpoint. Again, those map back into these APIs here. So that's just a little simpler for you. Instead of having to read through this documentation, the pre-built covers that for you. So that's our JST, those are our transformations. Next part is that I want to show you is our JSON form. If I search for the F5 again here, I'll pull that up. This is just like the workflow canvas drag and drop. You can see the different fields that have been entered here. Some of them have some defaults set. If you needed to modify things or add stuff, you just drag it over and drop it wherever you want. You click on the gear icon behind any of these, and that just shows you the information. So for instance, this partition is required, it's read-only. We've added some options in here. Options can be static. They could also be dynamic if you want to fetch them from an external system. This particular one, we wanted to make sure this partition was being set as common. We made it a drop-down in case we wanted to add more later, but we also made it read-only so nobody could change it, but we did want to make that available so folks knew it was there. So those are all the building blocks. Like I said, we had built this out, so let's go ahead and try to see if that works. So I'll pop back into, I was in Studio, so let's just click on Workflows here. We'll go back to our F5. This is our F5, the webinar build one we just did. So this particular automation here, we're ready to execute it. I told you we'd execute it from Operations Manager. So let's flip into there and build a new one. This was our build. So the way Operations Manager works, if you remember from the earlier conversation with our slides, the idea here is we're going to associate a workflow. This will be that build one we just did, and we're going to associate that with a trigger. For today, we're going to use a manual trigger. I'll just name it manual as well. The idea, though, is if you wanted to trigger this from a multiple amount of ways, you could do your events here. You could do your API calls if you wanted to expose it from a northbound system towards a northbound system. If you wanted to add a schedule, you could as well, or have multiple manual forms because maybe different teams are running these with different bits of information collected. So lots of ways you can do that there. We're going to go ahead and use that form we had just looked at, and I'll go ahead and just save this here. So now that's the first trigger there. I'll click play here so we can run it to test this out. We'll go ahead and do some new names here, so that we'll just call this one new pool. New pool from IAP, and we'll do new pool 1, set up a second member, new pool 2. We'll set these up with ports 80, and let's use 55.0.0.1 and 55.0.0.2. Now again, since I'm not integrating to IPAM, hopefully those are available, but we'll see in the workflow if things fall out. There are some error handles built into the pre-builts. If you were doing this in more of production grade capacity, definitely recommend connecting into IPAM or having some sort of process built into your automation that fetches those for you. Kind of the goals with automation is the least amount of input you can put in, the best you have, because you've built those rules in the system. You'll get some consistency, naming standards, and everything that goes with that. New pool VS1 and test virtual server. Our destination address 55.0.0.10, and we'll make this HTTPS with 443. I'll click run. Form validated the initial input, and we'll see the automation come through here. It looks like it's already created. It's gone through our transformation, gone through the pools, virtual server, payload, and sent out that Teams message. If I click visualize, I can see the visual audit, really handy when you're starting to build these out, so it looks just like the build view. And again, you can kind of just dig into any of these. So as an example, we'll dig into that Teams payload, look at the incoming, look at the outgoing, click close. You can do the same for any of these child steps here, just like we showed earlier. And you can kind of see that process again. Wrapping things up, if I hop over to Teams, we can see that the pool and members message right here, the pool created from IP, has been passed into Teams. So one last kind of tip here as you're building these out. Again, look at Itential pre-builts, see what's out there. If you got a change process you want to incorporate, your IPAMs, your any other bits and pieces, maybe this is a virtual server that as part of a larger application service, you can incorporate all of those in here. So that's what I wanted to share today. I want to thank everybody for watching. And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out to Itential. Browse through our website. You can find those pre-builts we talked about and other useful content. So thanks, everyone.